Good morning, everyone. My name is John Engelmann. I'm a principal consultant and chief software technologist with OPI in Minneapolis. And we're going to be talking about integrating Grails and Gradle together. I'm the current maintainer for the Gradle plugin for Grails. I took it over from Luke earlier this year because Luke's a busy guy and doesn't have time for this stuff. Most of the work that I've put into the plugin over the last year or so is from the work that I've done at my consultant. We have a multi-project build that has eight Grails applications in it and a couple Grails plugins. So we were writing a bunch of custom code in order to make that integrate better in a multi-project build, and then I fed that back into this plugin. So we're going to go over what the plugin does, how it kind of integrates, how that integration happens, and why some of the things in the plugin are the way they are, and why they probably won't get better for that stuff. All right, so getting started with the plugin, it's available in JCenter and Maven Central. So you just apply the plugin. Oh, everything I talk about here is with the current version of the plugin that's on the master branch. It's unreleased right now. So things might be a little bit different here than what's actually available. I hope to have this version out next week. So there's going to some of the things change. I'll kind of mention them as we go through. So once you have the plugin in your class path, you just apply the Grails plugin. And then you need to, before you start a project, you need to make sure you have your project version set. And this is because this is only if you're really initializing a new project, because Grails puts that information inside of the plugin descriptor or application.properties. Gradle will push this version across to Grails for that. So if you don't set it, you end up with like unspecified inside of those files, and it just gets kind of weird. So the best case is just to have the version set. And then the second piece that you absolutely need to set is you need to tell the plugin which version of Grails you want to use. So there's a Grails configuration block that gets an extension that gets added, and then you can just tell the Grails version from there. So I'll do we'll create a project and a plugin after I go through the slides here, and we can go through these things, and I'll demonstrate it with 2.4, which is the latest Grails version. There were the current versions of the plugin. There's a couple bugs regarding Grails 2.4 stuff. They moved some dependencies around, and I just fixed those this morning. So it worked when I initialized the project, but so hopefully that keeps working. So creating a Grails project, once you have that plugin in, there's just an init task that will start up a new Grails application. And there's also an init plugin task if you want to start a Grails plugin. So these are both just delegating out to those respective Grails scripts. So it's the same thing as having a Grails installation and calling Grails create app or Grails create plugin. All Gradle's doing it underneath the hood with this integration. There's a low-level library called Gradle Launcher that's maintained as part of the Grails core stuff. And it hooks into the same kind of runtime environment that the Grails script, like from your command line, if you type Grails, that's just a shell script that's executing a Java jar. And Gradle Launcher does that same thing, except it kind of takes all the extra stuff away from it. So the plugin, Gradle integrates to Grails by using that Grails launcher. And what it does is it sets up a context that has the bootstrap class path and your compile and test and runtime class paths. So Gradle does all I'm going to do that all during this talk, by the way. I'm going to say the wrong name. Gradle does all the dependency resolution through its mechanisms. So it gets all the files it gets all those dependencies onto disk and resolves all the conflicts. And then it just passes the paths to Grails through this context. So it creates this context, serializes it to disk, and then it forks off a JVM that has this Grails launcher in it, and it tells it this context is at this path. Grails launcher reads that context back in, gets all the class paths, and then just executes Grails. So it's just it's the same thing as that Grails script from your command line. Properly might be a strong word. It does. So the plugin will wire up spring-loaded by default for you. So it'll drop that onto the class path, and what it does is it does the same thing Grails does underneath the hood too, is where with your Grails script, if from a Grails installation, there's actually a logic check inside of that shell script that says that wires up the spring-loaded Java agent to the JVM that it's forking to actually execute Grails. Gradle will do that same thing for the JVM that it forks. So it should work. The current version of the plugin, it only works for run app, which is actually how Grails works as well. But there was no mechanism, when I made that change, if you wanted to define another run app task somewhere, you had no way of enabling reloading for that. Or if you wanted like a run app debug or something, you couldn't do it. So that should be fixed now, too, in the next version. Grails actually doesn't enable reloading for test app by default. Oh, okay. Yeah, so I've kind of strived to make the Gradle plugin operate as close. Oh, sorry. So his question was, does reloading work for test app? And the answer is no, because Grails doesn't do it by default either. It doesn't. It only puts the spring-loaded agent on for run app. So configuring dependencies is the same as a normal Gradle project. So you do this in your build.gradle. So the big difference here is build-config.groovy in a Grails project app has basically no effect in this plugin. The dependencies and repositories that you define in there don't get resolved in any way. Gradle's totally taking control of that dependency resolution mechanism from Grails, and it's calling into the system beyond that point. So Grails won't do it. It will. We're calling into the point where Grails does where it starts installing plugins, things like that. So Gradle can resolve a Grails source plugin, a plugin zip file, and it just passes that to Grails, and then Grails will install that because it sees it on the class path. A couple of the nice features inside of the repositories block, you can do Grails.central, and that will wire up a Maven repository that points to the Grails central repository. So that's where all Grails plugins live. So if you try to apply a Grails plugin without doing Grails.central in your repositories block, it won't resolve, because those things don't exist in Maven Central or JCenter or anything like that.
So in the build config in Grails, you have to separate out your plugins from kind of other jar dependencies. You have to do that here. It looks like you have plugins in the same dependency too.
Yep. So the question was, in a Grails project, in the build config, there's two separate blocks, one for dependencies and one for plugins. And the difference is the dependencies block contains only binary jar files. So the normal Java libraries or binary plugins, which I have yet to find someone who's actually published a binary Grails plugin. And then the plugins block is for Grails source plugins. And the difference is that the source plugins are a zip file that have non-compiled, they're just Groovy and Java files. And then Grails compiles that plugin in the same JVM or in the same environment as your project. So they did that in order so that a plugin can kind of exist across multiple Grails versions, because it's always getting compiled with the version of Grails that you're running, as opposed to what the plugin author was using. For Gradle, you don't need to do that. You define all your dependencies, regardless of if they're binary or source, inside your dependencies block. That gets passed to Grails, and Grails just figures out I think what happens underneath the hood, I haven't dug that far down. I think what happens is any zip dependency that Grails sees on there, it treats that as a source. So if you had some other zip dependency that wasn't a Grails plugin and you were trying to put it in there, I don't know why you would do that, but you might have a problem with something like that, because Grails might think it's a plugin and then it can't compile it, and it might get a little wonky. But yeah, so for Gradle, you don't have to separate those two things. Another difference here is that in a normal Grails project, for plugins, you don't have to specify the Maven group coordinate because all Grails plugins exist under org Grails plugins. In Gradle, you do have to specify that. It doesn't know anything about that. So for all your plugins, you have to put the org.grails.plugins on the front. Other parts. So the plugin creates configurations that map nearly the same to the Grails one. So there's a bootstrap configuration, which is the same as the Grails one, and compile and runtime and test and provided and resources are all the configurations that get created. So those all map to the counterpart inside Grails. And so that's a little different when you're moving from a normal Gradle project and like a Java Groovy Gradle project, because you have compile and test compile, runtime and test runtime. That concept doesn't exist within these things. So you want to make sure that you're defining these correctly. The plugin also wires up a bunch of it tries to wire some default dependencies up for you so you don't have to do as much work inside of here. But we don't add, most of that is regarding the Grails framework itself, getting the core Grails dependencies. But things like the Tomcat plugin, so that you have a container to run in, or assets pipeline, you'll need to add those. We don't wire any of that in for you just because some people aren't going to need that by default. And we don't, like when you initialize a new project with Grails, they create this build config that has like 17 different, oh man. They have like 17 different dependencies and plugins installed for you, and most of them people don't use all of them, so we just try not to do that. And it's constantly changing with Grails versions, and I don't really want to be going in here and having to maintain that list all the time. The plugin wires up 4 tasks by default for you. So this is where we get different from what's currently available to what will be available next week. And I'll touch on why I made that change. So there's a run, which corresponds to the Grails run app task. There's a test task that corresponds to the Grails test app, and that's not to be confused with like the Gradle test task. It's not that same type, so you can't treat the test task in a Gradle project the same way as in a Groovy job. It doesn't have the same options. It can't do, it can't fork multiple JVMs to run tests and things like that, because all of these tasks they're all delegating to Grails. It's actually spinning Grails up in a separate JVM and executing in there. So that's kind of the important thing to note is the plugin puts this facade in place that kind of makes a Grails project look like a normal Gradle project, but it's not. It's more like interacting with, if you were integrating Node or some other some other build system into Gradle, and all you're doing is forking off shell executions to call it. That's basically what this is doing. We just tried to pretty it up and make it work a little bit better in a multi-project environment and things. It also creates, there's a war and a package plugin task, and the plugin is smart enough to know which one of those tasks to create depending upon what kind of Grails project it is.
So if I had a plug from Gradle?
Right. Okay, so the question is, if you add a plugin, a Grails plugin that provides its own scripts, can you then execute those scripts from Gradle? Yes is the answer, with the caveat that it's the same thing that happens in Grails, where if you add the plugin in your build config and then try to run the script, it won't work, right? Because the plugin's not installed. You have to do something, you have to run a Grails command first to get the plugin actually installed, and then you can execute the script. The same thing should happen here as well. Let's see here. So war and package plugin, right? So the plugin looks to see, it just looks for that plugin descriptor file, and if that exists, then the plugin treats this project as though it's a Grails plugin project, and then it will create the package plugin task. Otherwise, it will create the war task. On top of this, the Gradle plugin will also create the same tasks that the Java base plugin for Gradle does. So that's clean, check, build, like that kind of standard build pipeline. It creates those same tasks and then wires these ones up to it. So there'll be an assemble task that gets created that's just a default Gradle task, and it will wire either war or package plugin to that assemble task. And then it will create a build task that is wired to assemble and check. So if you have this inside of a multi-project build with a bunch of other Java libraries, you can just do Gradle build from the command line, and you'll get the Grails war or the Grails zip out of it, along with all your other jars from the other projects too. A note here for tests, by default the test, we're executing test app just the same as Grails test app, so it executes all phases and all types. And war right now defaults to the dev environment instead of the prod environment like it does in Grails, and that's just because I set the default environment to be dev, and I didn't really realize that that was not working correctly. So you'll likely, when you do this, you'll probably want to configure the war task to be the prod environment instead of the dev environment. Package plugin also defaults to building a source zip instead of a binary. Like I said, I've never built a binary plugin. Well, I did this morning, just a test one, but you pass a command line, you just pass an argument that says -- binary, and then you get a jar instead of a zip. That actually might work better when you're dealing with Grails plugins inside of Gradle, because jars make more sense, and they don't have all the custom stuff that these Grails zips have. There's no special resolution or anything that has to happen with them. So that might work better. I'd love to see someone try that, and that's going to get old. This is my work laptop, and they have really restrictive screen timeouts, and I don't have the ability to change them. So some of the additional configurations. You can specify a Groovy version inside of the Grails block, and all that does is it configures a resolution strategy rule that locks any Groovy version to be Groovy all at that version. That's just something that we saw if you have on a multi-project build and you have a library that's building with a different version of Groovy, you don't want that, and then you include that into a Grails project. That Groovy version would override the one that Grails is dependent on, and that might work. I've never really tried that, but they say don't do that. But for the most part, I believe you could try and run Grails with a different version of Groovy than it ships with when you're doing this. No guarantees on that in any way whatsoever. You can also specify the spring-loaded version that you want. I think 1.1.3 is the default that's in the plugin, and I think Grails 2.4 runs with, I think, 1.2.0 release or something like that. So you can specify that here and just change it rather than having to declare it in the special dependency block and things. How are we doing for time? Oh, great. Right. In addition, the plugin creates a task rule that allows you to run any Grails scripts directly from the command line. So you don't have to create a task and do that. And the way we do that is you prefix it with Grails dash. So if you want to just execute a one-off script like the S3 quick start for Spring security or whatever, you can do that from the Gradle command line. So this is where we got into the reason why I changed some of the task names in the new version. Is currently we were creating the run app task to actually be Grails-run app, and that then supersedes the task rule, right? Because it's a hard declared task, and then you couldn't do a run app that was dynamic. And what's nice about the dynamic task, we'll get into. I wonder if that's. Yep. All right. So with the dynamic tasks, you can do the same thing that you do with Grails, where you can specify additional arguments or the environment on the command line. This only works for dynamic tasks inside of the plugin. So for war or package plugin or test or run, this won't work. If you specify these, they'll have no effect whatsoever. And I made that decision because I feel like your Gradle build file should be very repeatable. Doing these things on the command line doesn't let Gradle track that stuff. It's just overriding things. And so you could end up with a var that's different every time when you're specifying these properties. So for those built-in tasks that get wired into kind of this life cycle and pipeline, those should be defined inside your build.gradle file as actual tasks, and you should configure them how you want and not use these things. But for one-off tasks, you can do things like this. So I changed the name so that like the Grails run app to run, so that you had a way to execute run app dynamically and then pass these parameters in if you needed to. Yeah, so that has some bugs currently applies to the current version of the plugin, but this will be mostly fixed next week. All right, testing a Grails project from Gradle. Running tests is as simple as just Gradle test. Like I said, that'll execute all phases, all test types. And by default, we configure Grails to put its test reports into like the normal Gradle directory. So build, reports, test results, and things like that. So again, we're trying to make it look more like a normal Java Groovy project. That is overridable though. If you want to change that, if you want to put your tests in a different directory, you can change that on the Grails. There's a Grails test task type and it has some additional options for doing things like that. Where that might be useful is if you wanted to set up multiple plugins or multiple tasks for running different phases of tests. Like if you have a lot of unit or integration tests and you want to run them as two separate tasks, you can configure it then to put the test results in different directories. Because Grails by default deletes your test results when you run a test app. So if you change the phase and run tests again, if you had already run unit, it'll delete all those tests, and then you won't have those results anymore in your build. Another nice thing to do when I apply this plugin is I usually create this rule as well, and this allows people to execute a test phase just by typing in a test task on the command line for Gradle. So this just creates a task rule that says anything with test followed by something. We're going to peel off that prefix, and we're going to treat that as the phase to run. So you can do something like Gradle test unit or Gradle test integration, Gradle test functional, and just run those phases directly. You could make this even more complex where you could do like Gradle test unit Spock, and you could adjust this rule so that it passes the phase and the type in as well. One thing to note for when you're doing this is these arguments are getting passed directly to Grails. So you have to abide by the Grails syntax when you're doing this. So it's the same thing as passing the command line arg. So if you want to run the unit phase, it needs to be unit : and not just unit. If you want to run a specific test from the Gradle command line, you can do that as well. The Grails test tasks, they listen to a Gradle property called test.single. Again, that gets passed directly to Grails. So whatever the pattern matching that Grails does, where you can specify a name and it will kind of try and find, it follows those same rules because Grails is actually doing that work, not Gradle. What we don't support here is in the newer versions of Gradle where they have I think it's like test pattern, or it's like -- tests, and you can do like regex patterns and stuff on the command line. It's some more advanced pattern matching for running tests. We don't support that. Yeah.
So you said originally like the test task basically didn't work for arguments, and you're talking about the ones like the built-in arguments as opposed to the system property ones, like you have.
Correct. So the question there was, I had mentioned earlier that the built-in tasks didn't respond to arguments passed on the command line, and I was referring to these two. So -p Grails args and -p Grails env. They won't respond to those two, but the test task, the actual type of that class is wired to look for this Gradle property, this test.single. So that's built into the test type. And and only that. So this, if you do this to like the run app task, that that won't do anything. But I just wire this in because it's a nice convenience thing for people to be able to execute one-off tests instead of the whole suite. Here's an example of what we wanted to do for if you want to create multiple tasks to do your tests, if you want to split up your unit and integration tests. This is very useful in like a CI environment where you might have multiple jobs that you can run both of these aspects. So here I've created a test unit and a test integration task type. So, and it's this Grails test task. I've configured the phases to run for each one of them. And then I've set this test results dir to put the results in different directories so they don't step on each other. And then I've wired those two tasks to the check task so that they get executed as part of check. And then I've disabled the default test task because I don't want that one to run because that will by default execute all the phases and it's just redundant. So it's a little different in that if you ran this build and did a build, you would see, well, I get build, which is going to run check, and then check's going to run test unit and test integration, but not test. Yeah, no. Questions are great.
I was just wondering, why did you decide not to build this into the plugin and have only the test one that runs everything as opposed to that having, calling out to two other tasks?
Sure. So the question is, why didn't I build some of this stuff right into the plugin by default? Because mostly it's just a lot of stuff to maintain. The bigger your plugin gets, the more work you have to do to maintain it. And the Grails guys are iterating fairly fast, and lately they've been making significant changes between minor versions, and it's just kind of hard to keep up with it. I also am not doing a lot of Grails development right now. I'm supporting people who do Grails development, but I don't do a lot myself, so I'm not exposed to it every day to see what the pain points are. If you want to file an issue on there, on the GitHub project, I probably do it, and I would add some of this stuff to it. Doing this, where I split up the test phases, that I won't put into the plugin by default. But I might add that test rule that allows you to run phases and types. That's something that we could probably add without much impact. Advanced options and configurations. This is actually kind of a light section, but we'll just cover a couple of the things. Since we're forking a JVM in order to execute Grails, we have the normal ability to configure the properties on that JVM. So we all know with Grails, out of the box it works fine, but as soon as you start writing any code, you run into memory issues, usually permgen. So this is how you would configure the permgen properties for the Grails tasks when you execute them through Gradle. There's a JVM options block, and then you can set the various properties there. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, does this not allow class unloading at the JVM level?
Reloading?
Yeah,
or
unloading. You can actually set an unloader.
Oh.
And you can do it, say, in time the classes load that you're going to completely run in garbage collection. It's going to say unload every class before you reload.
That's a Grails feature, or just a normal JVM thing?
I think it's a JVM feature.
Okay. So the question was about setting like class unloading properties. You have full access to the JVM args here. You can pass any. So for example, like the way that Spring Loaded gets on here is via Java agent. It's doing this underneath the hood. It's just specifying JVM args on the. So this is actually using Gradle's built-in Java exec, class or whatever to do this. And so any options that you have there, you'll have available here.
We just won't have to restart.
Right.
So we usually set the class unloader to true, and then like
Sure.
Nth time, which would be third, every third time you're gonna, so you don't have the permgen
Yep.
problems. So.
That's cool. Something that I usually do in a lot of in my projects, especially multi-projects where we have multiple Grails projects, I configure this via I do like project.tasks with type Grails task. So I tell Gradle to configure all Grails test tasks with these properties. So if someone adds a new task type, or if you run like a dynamic script from the Gradle command line using that task rule, then you can get these you can get these things onto there. Because what happens underneath the hood in Gradle when you do that like dynamic test type is it actually creates a concrete task then to actually execute. And so if you configure this using a tasks with type Grails task, then it will pick up and that configuration action will run against that concrete task that it just created. So you can make sure, like if you're going to do those dynamic tasks, you can still get the memory settings in there and not blow up on you. Handling project versions. This one's kind of interesting because Grails does its own like version stuff. And there's no way to pass that version information to Grails, right? Grails reads it out of application.properties or it reads it from the plugin descriptor. You can't pass a version on the command line. The only way you can do it is via set version. So in the current versions of the plugin, this is what I've done a lot of times is I create this set version task that calls Grails set version. And then I wire up the Gradle input outputs to look at those files and hash them. And then I basically wire this task as a dependency to any other Grails task. WAR or package plugin are really kind of the only ones that you need that for because you want to make sure the version is set before you package up your WAR and package up your plugin. And this works pretty great. The new version of the plugin, you won't need to do this though, because I found in Gradle's Maven integration, they actually had some code for syncing these versions programmatically rather than like doing something like this. And I lifted all that code and put it into our plugin. So now any Grails task that runs, the first thing it does is it tries to syncs the version against what's in the Gradle file. So it basically does this same thing. It's parsing application.properties and it's parsing the plugin descriptor and grabbing the version and comparing it to what you have set in the Gradle project. So anytime you run a Gradle task using the new version of the plugin, it'll set that version.
So how late does it do that in the?
Right away, right when it's the first thing the task executes with. So yeah.
So nuts.
You don't want it to do that?
We calculate version very late.
Oh.
All right.
Interesting.
I'll keep that way I do it.
Sure. So that question was just about when the version gets set during the task, and the Netflix guys do some version calculation stuff that's pretty elaborate. We can talk about that. We can see what we can do for you. Right. So that's the next slide is the same thing. In 2.10, you won't have to do anything to set those versions. A couple other caveats. There are certain Grails scripts that won't work via Gradle. The main one, really the only one I know of, is upgrade. You can't do a Gradle Grails-upgrade from the plugin. It won't work. And that's because the upgrade script in Grails requires an actual installation of Grails. Because it copies files out of there, and we don't have that. We're resolving that as part of the class path. The Grails guys have kind of gotten away from that upgrade script. They don't really recommend using it. They just say, well, just look at the release notes and fix things that you need to do. So there really shouldn't be so there really shouldn't be a whole lot that you have to do from Grails version to Grails version.
Actually, I think they said 2.4 doesn't work.
Is it actually broken in 2.4 itself?
They basically just don't do the same.
Okay, yeah. So, right, if you do try to run that, you end up with like an infinite loop type thing because it ends up like asking for input or something, and it's kind of weird. Right now, the plugin also doesn't pass the non-interactive switch by default. So if you have a Grails plugin installed and you change the version in Gradle and run a task, that'll actually kill the build because it ends up in an infinite loop waiting for you because it's prompting you, do you want to upgrade this plugin? Yes or no? Excuse me. And there's no way to get that. There's no way to get that input in. So 2.10 will pass the non-interactive switch by default to all Grails commands, so that you won't run into that problem. So just be aware that if you upgrade something, it's going to get upgraded when it runs into Grails. Cool. So that's all I have for slides. Does anyone have any questions right now?
single Grails project build, would you consider using the Gradle plugin?
I would, because I really dislike Grails' build system. But I mean, it might be more convenient for people to have that. Gradle makes it a little bit easier to manage and reason about some of this stuff when you're doing a build.
Snapshot dependencies don't function in the Grails thing properly, so I think that in itself is enough reason to.
Yeah. So the comment was in
Local cache repository.
yeah yeah.
.Gradle's cache instead of .Grails.
Yep. So the comments were in a normal single project build where you're just building a Grails app, would I use Gradle? And I would. And most of the comments were about dependency resolution and things like that. Gradle's much better at it than Grails is. Grails has gotten better since they brought the Ether resolution engine in some of the later versions, but it's still just kind of a mixed bag of stuff. And that, yeah, I mean, Gradle's just much better at it and can do those things a lot easier for you. Great. All right. So we're just going to run through. Let's see here. We'll actually run the plugin here a little bit. Why can I not? There we go. Cool. And then I got to do. All right. Can't. Make sure if at any point you can't see something or I'm moving too fast, just yell at me. And all right, so we're just gonna create a new application here. All right, so I just created the directory that we're going to be in, and like any Gradle project, by default, the project name gets pulled from the directory that you're in. So to do app is just gonna end up being the name of our project. So we'll create our build.gradle file. And like I said, I only have this locally right now, so we're going to pull that out of my local dependency. All right. We'll apply the plugin, give ourselves a version. All right, so we've grabbed our plugin, applied it, set our version, and then specified our Grails and Groovy and spring-loaded versions that we want. Like I said, these two lines, Groovy and spring-loaded version, not necessary. You don't have to set them. Just kind of a nice to have. So in our directory, we still just have our build.gradle file, and then we're going to run Gradle init in here. So this will initialize a new Grails project for us. Oh yeah. So I forgot to add our repositories here.
If you don't have Grails on your command line or path or whatever, will it go and download things and make it work, or do you have to have Grails installed locally for these commands to work?
Sure. So the question was, do you have to have a Grails installation on your machine for this to work? And the answer is no. You don't. So there's actually there's no reference to Grails Home at all. What happens here is all the Grails core is available as a bunch of jars, and the Grails plugin for Gradle adds all those dependencies to your class path, so that it's doing all that heavy lifting and getting that stuff set up for you. But then that's also why like the upgrade command doesn't work, because there's no Grails Home installed. That also assumes you can get through a firewall. However, all the same, you still have the power of Gradle's dependency system here, right? So it's like, okay, so right? So we tried to run and it failed right here because it couldn't find Grails Bootstrap because I hadn't configured where to get that thing from. I hadn't configured a repository. So I'm going to tell it, well, look in JCenter and Grails.central. If you have a hosted Artifactory solution or something, you would need to get those libraries into there, and then you can just configure this to point to that, and it will work.
I would have to get those libraries into there as opposed to having the Grails installation.
Yeah, yep. So there, you would need to some other mechanism have that available, unfortunately. All right, so we've wired up our repositories now, so this should work this time. And Grails is very chatty when it runs, so you get a lot of output like this. So we've created our application, and we now have a full-fledged Grails application right in here. It's added the Grails wrapper and things like that, so if you wanted to use regular Grails to run something in here, you could do that. The caveat is that any dependencies and stuff will be messed up, because if you try to run Grails, it's going to use build config.groovy to resolve stuff. And so if you really wanted to do something like that, you'd have to declare dependencies in both places, and that's just kind of a mess. So we can look at some of the other things. So if we look at our application.properties, we can see it passed the Gradle project name into here, so it configured it with that, and it also passed our version in and configured that as well. All right. So the next thing we're going to do, if we tried to run this right now, we'll get an error because there's no runtime container installed in this project, so it doesn't know what to do. So we'll add those things in. Let's see here. Let me grab. All right, so here we're adding the Tomcat plugin onto the Bootstrap class path. So Bootstrap, if you don't know from Grails, that's basically, it's synonymous with like build script in Gradle. It's the class path that's used to execute the Grails environment, not your application. So you put it on Bootstrap here because it's actually, Grails needs to start the Tomcat container that your application is gonna live in. And then we're gonna add this, the Grails Asset Pipeline plugin as well. So we can see here, so now that we did that, we can see that Grails is now installing that zip plugin for us. It's also grabbing some additional, like all these additional plugins. So it'll resolve those dependencies as well, because, well, Gradle will. So because the Tomcat plugin has a POM file in it when it resolves this, Gradle resolved that as well. And so anything that the Tomcat plugin was dependent upon will get passed as well. So if you have a plugin that depends on a plugin, that should resolve properly and work, assuming that the plugin has a valid POM, which wasn't always true for older versions of Grails. It then started compiling. So this is Grails doing the compilation of the code, not Gradle, right? So at this point, we've completely handed off control to Grails, and Gradle is just sitting, trying to listen, waiting for this Grails process to die. So when you run, so one of the interesting things is when you run app from Gradle, your Gradle build never finishes. It just sits here at 0% because it's waiting for that forked JVM to run, or to finish what it's doing. But at this point, we can. Oh, I killed it. So I was going to show you that, but yeah, right. So the way to get out is you just Control-C break out of Gradle, and it will kill that Grails application at that point.
So is the version in a separate VM?
All right, so the question was just how the VMs are separated between all this stuff. So you have your Gradle VM that's actually running your build, and then it forks a Java process that does all the Grails stuff. So, but you won't get any forking beyond. Well, that's kind of. You have your Gradle VM, you have your Grails VM. You could potentially have a third VM beyond that because of Grails forking mode. By default, when you call through the Grails launcher, forking mode is disabled. So that shouldn't happen by default. You shouldn't get a third JVM because the reason why they added the forking mode to Grails was to do some more class path isolation, because things like this where you put Tomcat on the Bootstrap class path, that would leak into your application as well. And they couldn't properly reason about those things. So they did the forking mode in order to keep what's needed to run Grails separate from what's needed to run your application. The big driving point there was really if you wanted to upgrade your version of Groovy, right? Because before they did that, there was no way that you could run with a Groovy version that was different from the Grails version, from the version that Grails shipped with. With forking mode, that's theoretically possible. I haven't heard them talk about that being a feature of forking mode, but so by default, when you since Gradle is doing all that kind of class path management stuff, we don't have that class path issue, that leaking issue, because it's forking that new JVM, so that it's doing the same thing that Grails implemented. It's forking a new JVM to keep those things isolated. So it shouldn't fork another one underneath the hood, but you probably could get it to do it if you set all the properties correctly. But by default, the Grails launcher doesn't in process mode where it doesn't fork a new JVM itself. So if you wanted to do something where you're listening, I don't know if that would be possible.
I've basically been doing things to kind of hack because the spring-loaded stuff kind of sort of works, and it works most of the time, but just with all the meta-class craziness going on, it's really easy to have something blown up. And so we end up in this kind of life cycle where anytime anything explodes on the page, like the first thing you have to do is go, well, is it something I wrote, or and so because of that, you end up kind of downing the thing and upping it anyway. And so I've been working on setting up like a callback to the spring-loaded thing, so that I could basically have it run some tests, and then if it's in explosion mode, like basically bounce the VM and stuff.
Interesting. Right. So the comment was basically listening in on spring loaded, so that when something weird happens with the class path, you could automatically restart that Grails JVM. That's interesting. I'm not quite sure how you would implement that. I feel like it would be the same as any other Gradle. If you're doing it for like any other type of thing, like say you had a microservice based on Drop Wizard or something that you were running from Gradle. I mean, if you could do it that way, you should be able to do it here, because in the end you have Gradle and you have a forked JVM. So whatever controls you can put in there, that should work. You could then kill that. You could kill that forked process. You could have a handle to that and kill that thing, and then start another one. Yeah, that's. I'd love to see. But like, I'd love to see that code someday. I've never tried anything like that. Yeah. So that's interesting. All right, so here now it actually runs, right? So we get the default Grails application with all its niceties and stuff like that. Oh, that probably errored out. I shouldn't have clicked on that. Yeah, that's because I don't have any assets or anything. Right, so reloading though, we'll break this open. So I have my app running, and if I go into Grails app controllers here, All right, so all we've defined is a simple foo controller. I think that all that syntax is right. Yeah. I'm a clever person, you can tell. Foo and hello world. I think the syntax is right. So I've created this controller, and once I save it, Grails should pick it up, but maybe not. No, there it goes. All right. So we see Grails project watcher is running. It saw this new class, and it tried to compile it and run it, and I don't know what I.
Parentheses on the class definition line.
Oh, thanks. You're just waiting for it to fail before you threw that out there too. All right. There we go. So we can see like it's the normal. You get all the normal Grails stuff. It discompiled it, and it should make it. See, this is what happens when you try to live code things in presentations. Yeah. Whatever. I'm not even going to try to figure out what's wrong with that thing. I'm sure I just typed something. Anyway, you can see that class reloading and all that kind of stuff works. We could potentially do. We'll do it this way, and then it will be a whole lot better. Grails create controller. Oh, this is actually a really good example. So we're going to call the create. I think it's create controller. And we need to pass it args for that. Cool, that actually, that worked. All right, so we called the Grails create controller script, passed in the foo controller, and Grails created that controller for us. We can see that it just picked up that change and is firing that off. And there we have a foo controller. And that errored. I know that errored because I don't have a GSP in there. But if we go into our file now, Grails app controllers. What am I doing? What? Oh, thanks. Helpful attendees today. Right, so class reload and that all works. So that's really all the example that I wanted to do. If people wanted to see a plugin, we could do a plugin, but it's really basically the same thing. Some of the interesting things to deal with. If you are dealing with plugins via this mechanism, you're probably in for a little bit of a world of hurt because Grails plugins are just kind of weird in how they do things. So if you want to publish a Grails plugin from Gradle, you're gonna be banging your head for a while because what I've found. So I tried this initially and I ran into problems, and so I just kind of like brute forced it. The Gradle Maven and Maven Publish plugins don't generate the correct POMs and necessary details for Grails plugins because they're all like this special case type stuff. You could probably get it to do it. It's not going to work by default. You're basically going to have to write the POM yourself. On the alternative, you can use the Grails release plugin, which is what you would normally use for it. But that kind of acts weird when you're in like a multi-project build because when you package a plug, you can't tell it where to put that zip. Like it always packages a plugin to write to the root directory, and you can't change it. It's not a configurable option in Grails. And then the releases plugin, whenever you run it, it always rebuilds that zip So if you're trying to do like up-to-date checking and things in your Gradle build where you only build the parts that I need, every time you release that plugin, it rebuilds that zip, which causes anything that downstream relies on it to also rebuild because that dependency is changing. So it's just kind of a mess. So we in our project we have a Grails plugin that is not used by any of the Grails applications in the multi-project build. We have some legacy Grails applications that don't exist in our multi-project build. They use that plugin, so we don't share it that way. So we build that plugin and we publish it, but we've basically written the POM ourselves. And there's also inside of a Grails plugin, there's it's like plugin.xml or something, which is an auto-generated file that has like here's all your Grails artifacts that are in this plugin, your controllers and taglibs and domains. Gradle doesn't know anything about that. It doesn't know how to build that. So you have to call in. You either have to manually write that file and then do something funky where you're copying it in, or you got to use the Grails release plugin in order to generate that thing correctly. Like I said, that's why I think binary plugins would work better because that stuff doesn't exist, and then you're just dealing with a jar. So there's some more. I got to do some more use cases around that and stuff, and figure out what works the best. Time frame wise, this plugin is really just a stopgap measure for getting Grails and Gradle to play together, and that's why, like, some of this stuff looks nice. We put some effort in to make these things work, but we're not going to like try and totally make it work 100% completely because Grails 3 is going to rewrite their build system to be based on Gradle. Who knows when Grails 3 comes out? Next year, late next year maybe would be my guess. But they're going to replace the entire build system with Gradle at that point, which is going to, yeah, that's. And they're making progress. They've already merged in. They're completely based on Spring Boot now as well. So they've ripped out all their stuff there, and they're just basically a bunch of sugar on top of Spring Boot, a bunch of conventions on top of Spring Boot, which is cool. So yeah, so that when that day comes, then I won't have to give this talk anymore about stuff. So, yeah.
So we ended up writing, so we do a lot of outsourced projects and stuff, and ended up having all these shared plugins and stuff that became this just really painful nightmare. So I've got like a bunch of kind of extension stuff we did in the Grails build script stuff for being able to do plugin packaging, so we could get the artifact management to kind of sort of work, but still the dependency resolution stuff we had to hack around that too. I'm wondering if that would be something that would be worth putting in the Grails plugin to help with just all the stuff that isn't there.
Sure.
Because I mean, Grails 3 is still like a good
Yeah.
ways off.
Yeah.
It's painful trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, if there's stuff that you guys want to donate out there, I mean, you can just file an issue that just has the description of the stuff, and if you can point me to if the code's out there somewhere, we can look at pulling something in. You don't need to write like a whole. I mean, if you want to, go for it, right? You know, add the feature and send a pull request. That'd be awesome.
That might actually be something that might even be better as a separate Gradle plugin.
Yeah, an additional plugin that's based on top of this one might be cool. Oh, I almost forgot that. So one of the things about this is when you apply the Grails plugin, don't apply a Java or a Groovy plugin into that same project as well. That won't work. People do that a lot because, especially some more like inexperienced people, because they're like, well, Grails is based on Groovy, right? So I should apply the Gradle Groovy plugin. You'll just get errors because they're both trying to create the same tasks and they don't care about each other. And so I'm actually thinking about putting in an assertion error if you attempt to do that. But I mean, you would end up trying to have, like, Gradle would end up trying to actually compile Grails, and that's just not going to work in any way whatsoever. So it's just not a supported feature. There are some ways that you can hack things like the Gradle CodeNarc or the Gradle FindBugs plugin. They require you to have the Groovy plugin or the Java plugin installed by default to use those things. But there are ways to manipulate those plugins to apply them to a Grails project without applying the Groovy and the Java. So we actually do that. We don't use the Grails CodeNarc plugin. We use Gradle's CodeNarc plugin to check our Grails projects. And that's, if you look at the Gradle source code for those plugins, it defines what the base plugin needs to be for there. So if you override that, if you create a class that extends that and you change that parameter, then you can say, well, I want my base plugin is Grails, and then it will apply and it will work.
So would that also allow me to use the Jacoco plugin?
That probably won't work because Jacoco integrates with the test task and it wires up a bunch of stuff there. The test task in the Grails plugin it's not a Gradle test task, so it won't apply correctly. Would be my guess. For coverage, I would definitely.
For Grails, you end up really using Copatura.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
that actually does the binding.
Yep. You might be able to do it by. All the Jacoco plugin doing is registering the agent as a Java agent. You could probably do that with the Grails project. You would just have to do it manually. You'd have to get the jar and wire it up yourself. So. Great. I'll just give you a short, quick thing on OPI. OPI is Java, Groovy, JavaScript, mobile, and open source. Basically all open source technologies. We're in Minneapolis. We have about 100 consultants. We've really grown over the last 3 years. We have offices in Minneapolis and Omaha, and then we have a couple people in Chicago and Denver as well. And our average tenure is about 5 years right now. We've had some people that have been with the company for about 15 years as consultants and stuff. So if you guys if you have any work that you want to do out, we got some really sharp people and do some good work, and we'd love to talk with you. So thanks for coming. Appreciate it.